In this particular section, we're going to be looking at not just to understand, but also identify different aspects of behavior in physical activity settings. Specifically, we're going to focus on the group settings in sport. While in the previous section, we focused more on not just the basics of sports psychology, but also really how to understand and engage with the individual. This particular section, we're going to look at the group setting. In particular, the purpose of section 2 is to do the following. We want to introduce the basic concepts of psychological arousal, stress, anxiety, and depression. We're also going to identify and describe coping and intervention strategies. We're going to discuss and look at how these popular behavioral change models might be relevant to us here in the Department of Sport Management. And then finally, we're going to identify and describe types of goals and the goal setting process. Let's talk about arousal, stress, anxiety, and depression. Performance oftentimes is associated with what we call the mind-body dichotomy or the emotion-body dichotomy. Really what we're looking at here is that we have the physical body and then we have the mental aspect of whatever it is we're doing. What's going to be really important about that is managing emotions. And what we know is that a person's psychology is so powerful, it can actually manifest itself with physical symptoms. And this is what we call the psychosomatic response. This might be something like getting butterflies in your stomach because you have to go and talk in front of a class, and that creates a little bit of anxiety for you. Or maybe you're going to get the sweaty palms or things like that. You can think of some really famous athletes that talk about getting so nervous before an athletic event that they actually throw up, and maybe they do this their entire 10, 12, 15-year career. That's really what we're talking about with the psychosomatic response, is that emotions are powerful and they inform the body to do different things. The sympathetic alarm response in the body is caused by a lot of information or stimulation from some particular source. If we're thinking about athletic performance, then maybe it's the crowd, the energy from the crowd, maybe it's the pressure of the game of the moment, those types of things. Well, that stimulation from that particular source activates the body's stress response, and this is going to be your fight or flight, right? So adrenaline is going to be pumped into the bloodstream. The mental state is influencing the body's physiological response, which can actually be measured, whether it's heart rate, blood pressure, muscle tension, electrocortical activity in the nervous system, all these different types of things. And that's really how we start to engage with understanding a psychosomatic response and start using what we have from the medical field to kind of measure and chart the impact that the mental state is having on our performance. Both our emotions and our environment, whatever the environment is at the time, right? Whether it's a sporting event, whether it's the pressure of an exam while you're in class, that's what I'm talking about when I say environment. These things are going to influence the person's ability to perform. And so related to performance is this idea of processing information. Think about the social environment in which you're sitting right now. Think of all the different sources of information. Maybe it's coming from your phone, maybe there are a lot of people around, so there's potential distractions. Now, imagine yourself in a very large sporting event. Think of the sights, the sounds, the smells. All that is going to be considered information. How we gather and interpret that information from the environment around us is going to be important to our mental well-being. It should be noted that information that we bring in from the environment around us is going to be measured in kind of what we call bits, right? So there's little bits of information that we're taking in consciously and subconsciously. And the more bits of information that are available, the more difficult it gets to interpret all of the information around us, and as a result, our performance, right? So here's a sport example. So in baseball, you might have a pitcher who has total control over 4 pitches, right? Compare that to a pitcher who has total control over 2 main pitches. Which pitcher is going to be more difficult for the batter? Well, it's going to be the pitcher that has control, the total control over the 4 pitches, because there's more information potentially that the batter has to look for, has to try and gather, and then has to interpret in that, in the milliseconds that the baseball is coming to them. All right, so that's what we talk about when we're trying to gather all this information. It should be noted as well that the mind what we try to do with what the brain does is it takes all this information, it sort of funnels down into measurable bits of information that we try to digest and focus on. So, as the skill of an athlete is going to increase, then the amount of information that's going to be conveyed between athletes in an athletic contest is going to increase, right? So if you just look at something like, I have listed here a basic football play, fly right, jet 48 zone, okay? Now that might be more simplistic because it's for a more amateur level of football player. As the individual moves up in from amateur into elite amateur and maybe even into professional, then you start to see that the amount of information that's going to be conveyed in something like a basic football play call is going to get more and more complicated. Therefore, the athlete, in order to be successful in their performance, has to process more information. Humans have this unique ability to selectively attend to one stimulus to the exclusion of others, right? And this is really, there's all this information in the environment, and we do have the ability to focus on one or two things and try to block out all the other quote unquote noise. For the highly trained and highly skilled athletes, the process of selective attention is very efficient and allows them to compartmentalize and avoid distractions. This skill, though, the skill of being able to compartmentalize, for some people it's more natural, but it is something, a skill that can be developed over time. It's something that you can develop alongside with the athletic talents or the technical aspects of whatever sport you're a part of. So processing the information and that ability or inability, however you want to look at it, to focus on the execution is associated with a couple different explanations from pop culture, right? So if that ability to focus in, kind of a positive pop culture explanation, we just call it being in the zone, right? So think of a sport example where maybe you were in the zone or maybe you witnessed some athlete that was in the zone. From the game of basketball, you might have someone who just feels like they can't miss a shot, right? They often talk about, they almost can't hear the crowd. Michael Jordan used to do this. I can't hear the crowd. I just can only see the bucket. I can only see the rim, and it looks much larger than usual. He even talks about at some point that the defender in front of him, he almost couldn't see him because he knew he could get around him. So he was looking at the next 2 or 3 defenders. All right, so that's a great example of being in the zone. A negative explanation of this kind of ability or the inability to compartmentalize and avoid some of those distractions, we often call choking or panicking. There are a number of high-profile examples from the world of sport where you think of someone choked, quote unquote, in the moment. They didn't hit a shot, or maybe they struck out, or they, booted a ground ball, or they missed a penalty kick, whatever it is. We often talk about from a fan's point of view, well, they didn't rise to the moment. That's kind of a pop cultural explanation for potentially this inability to compartmentalize and avoid those distractions such as pressure or crowds cheering, etc. Being in the zone really is a result of intense mental and physical preparation. We talk a lot about muscle memory, right? Well, muscle memory is not just for the brain. It's also for the body, and what you want to do is you want to bring those two things together. And the muscle that is the brain is extremely powerful, and you're going to train it just like any other muscle in the body. And so this might explain why a very elite level or superior athlete indicates that they almost feel unconscious, right? They don't really remember, or they can't really comprehend what they're doing or how they're doing it. And again, that choking or panicking is really the exact opposite, right? It's a lack of ability to focus on things. And so it's really shifting of the attention from that muscle memory and almost thinking too much about what you're trying to do. If you're trying to field a ground ball, instead of almost letting the 10,000 hours that you've practiced for fielding a ground ball in baseball or softball, you start focusing too much and you get out of that muscle memory, and potentially you set yourself up for a negative outcome. The panicking really is in reference to an athlete reverting back to instincts and sort of quits thinking and quits relying on logic or relying on their training and what they've done. And sometimes you'll see this where the coach asks, well, why did you do that? And potentially the athlete has no clue as to why they did it. And it kind of is in this vein of panicking, if you will, where you don't rely on your training and you don't rely on logic. You just, it's almost a sense of self-preservation in that moment. Attention control training and this whole concept of centering is very important in elite athletics. So the idea, as we talked about, is you want to learn how to filter out all the information, all the bits of information in the environment that are not relevant to your success. You want to learn to control the emotions. You want to learn to control the excitement and manage those things. So we talk about that as a process that they call thought stopping and centering, right? So first, you're going to displace the negative thought with a positive thought, right? If you focus primarily on a negative outcome, striking out, missing the penalty kick, missing the putt, whatever it is, then the way that this idea goes is that you have a greater likelihood of making that a reality. So you want to be positive. Next, you want to center your intention internally, right? And you want to, when they talk about making minor adjustments in arousal, is you want to start to manage the excitement, right? Don't get too high, don't get too low. Start to try to keep calm. And we're going to talk about, later in this section, some different ways of keeping calm. You want to focus your attention on what we call a task relevant cue, right? There's all this information you really want to focus. So let's say you're in the Tour de France and you are in a very, very difficult stage in cycling, right? For those of you that don't know the Tour de France, very, very rigorous, long cycling event, all right? And so one example is on that task relevant cue, you might actually focus on some mechanistic aspect of the sport that you are involved with. So focusing on what you and your body and what you're doing. You also might focus on something like the wheel of the bicycle that's in front of you, right? And you just kind of focus on that. You kind of calm your excitement, and then that allows you to then, step 4, execute the sport skill. And so really training and having an articulated process like we just talked about helps the athlete's mind locate the memory easily. Elite athletes have been doing whatever their sport is for tens of thousands of hours, right? There is that muscle memory. There is the reservoir of knowledge that I've done this before in my training. What you want to do is you want to have a short thought-stopping process where you can then almost automatically find that memory, grab it, and then have it impact your performance. What hopefully that is going to do is help you to be consistent and productive in whatever it is you're doing within the sport. Here are some basic examples, whether it's diving and gymnastics. You have golf and cycling. And I tried to provide a wide number of examples because not everyone's going to be involved in just football, basketball. Right? There are a lot of different sports. There are a lot of different ways. You can also use a lot of this performance psychology in aspects of physical fitness as well. So really what the idea, though, is that you are examining the situation. You're training your body and your mind to perform a task regardless of the amount of information, excitement, however you want to phrase it, all the stuff going on around you. And you want that to be second nature. All right, so let's transition from all this neuropsychology to talking about something else. We know that the neurophysiology of something is going to impact its arousal and anxiety. However, arousal, anxiety, and stress are really not the exact same thing. They're interrelated, but they are separate. So we want to differentiate amongst these so that we can really identify if we need specific coping mechanisms or strategies to address each one. Arousal means that you are psychologically activated. You're engaged. You're starting to get excited. Your mental reactions, your emotions, all those things are starting to become awakened, right? So effective arousal means your emotions, your moods, and your feelings, all these things have been engaged by something Oftentimes for us, that something is the situation, the environment, the group setting, right? So you are excited, but the moment you run out to the field or you step onto the court and you see all of the individuals and you hear the cheers and the chants either for or against you, right? This might be the beginning of it. This could be something like arousal. Emotions, moods, and stress are different. Now, Lazarus did identify 15 different emotions, and anxiety is just one of them. So emotions are going to be sudden reactions to a situation, and they're going to last for a relatively short amount of time, seconds, minutes, hours, those types of things. The moods are going to be a little bit more amorphous, a little bit more diffuse, and they may last for days, weeks, potentially even months. All right, and this is really, really important to us because as we start thinking about how that might relate to stress, well, stress is something different than emotions and moods. Right? So stress is that non-specific response of the body. Again, we're back to the body and the mind dichotomy. So a non-specific response of the body to any demand placed upon it. So that means stress is not just this monolithic one thing. There's actually good stress, what we call eustress. And then there's bad stress, distress. So when people talk about stress, oftentimes most of the time they're talking about distress. But an example of good stress is when you're working out, right? You want to stress that muscle. That's eustress. Sometimes, a little bit of structure, such as a deadline to write a paper or a deadline to complete a project for work or something like that, that could be eustress, okay? And so you want to make sure that you're understanding, how the eustress and the distress are going to engage with one another. For many athletes, you have distress on the field. We know that. But a lot of distress could occur away from the field or the court or the ice or wherever they're involved in their sport. And these might be the things that are impacting them as an athlete or impacting them as a coach, impacting them as a human being. And so that's what we want to make sure that we understand, that these emotions, moods, and even this concept of stress are a little bit more nuanced than maybe we normally talk about in the world of pop culture. The stress process, anytime you try to graph it out so you kind of get a linear understanding, 3 basic steps to it, right? The environmental situation. And this really is what's going on. And I would encourage people to think about, I like to use the example of student athletes because it's a very, very potentially stressful status being a student athlete, because you have a lot of things you have to do. You have a lot of obligations to your schoolwork. You have a lot of obligations to potentially donors and volunteer hours. In your community, you also have a lot of potential obligations to your sport, whether it's working out, focusing on nutrition, practicing, those types of things. Well, so that's understanding just what's going on around you. And then now the second part of that 3-step process is the appraisal of the situation. And this is where you start to kind of think, is this stress going to be something good or bad for me? Right? If it's distress, then you want to make sure that you have the appropriate coping skills in place so that it's not going to become destructive in your life. But you're really just asking yourself, what is going on and how do I feel about everything that's going on? Am I overwhelmed? If so, then that potentially could be a form of distress. Now you can manage that distress, like I said, with coping skills, and then so that way that distress does not accumulate into something truly negative and having a negative impact on your life. Finally, the stress response, the 3rd step in this process. It's really, this part is really interesting because, as you kind of think about stress, oftentimes this entire process is not necessarily conscious, right? You're kind of going through, but the stress response is really, it's about managing that, right? And so again, we're going to be talking about these coping skills because being able to see how we manage these things indicates whether that stress process or that response to stress is going to have a long-term impact that is either good or bad for the individual, for the coach, the athletic department, the team, those types of things. I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about additional forms of anxiety in sport. So here are a couple of them. Time to event, pre-competitive anxiety. So this is going to be something kind of before the event. So kind of the lead up to it, maybe you have cognitive anxiety, which is the emotional response to anxiety. And it's going to start high and it's going to really remain high as the game or the match approaches. But then it might fluctuate throughout the game or the contest based off of whether you're doing well or you're doing poorly, those types of things. Again, now we have this somatic anxiety, and again, this is the bodily response. Remember, we talked about the psychosomatic response, right? Somatic being the body response, and this is going to start low, but increases very, very rapidly as we get closer to the event. Okay, now it usually the sort of nerves in the body and that kind of stuff. Your energy level usually levels out once the event begins. So in the game of football, a lot of people talk about, well, I just need to get hit the first time and then I kind of calm down. And that's sort of in reference to somatic anxiety, which then helps you. Once you achieve somatic anxiety, then sometimes it will help to manage or streamline the process for cognitive anxiety. Perfectionism is something that is really been impactful, something we've been examining for years now. And it's really interesting because it's not just at the elite level. It might happen in youth sports as well. So perfectionism is not something that just happens to those professional athletes, but normal or adaptive perfectionism. And this is where, right, the highly motivated athletes want to make sure that they engage in the appropriate training, right? And we've talked about the 10,000 hours in terms of being a mastery of a particular task, right? Just kind of a rule of thumb, if you will. The motivated athlete is going to do that. I remember the first time when I was younger, I was not a great basketball player, but I'm right-handed, right? So learning to dribble with my left hand, it was not my natural or dominant hand, so you had to be extremely motivated and almost sort of focusing on, I want to perfect the skill of dribbling with my offhand, as it were. Neurotic perfectionism is when it becomes extremely destructive. And it's going to start impacting the self-esteem. It's going to start making you feel guilty or ashamed of something. And this is something that we've looked at and been able to track, again, like I said, in youth sports, all the way up to elite professional athletes. That neurotic perfectionism that is very destructive, it combines with the personality characteristics that are going to lead this to distress and needing to be addressed by some sort of professional. Depression. This is something that obviously is very commonplace in terms of the public discourse. A lot of discussion both in sports and out of sports in regards to depression. Most people do get down at times. Depression, however, it's going to be an illness that interferes and impacts daily life, and that's really kind of the beginning point for a discussion of depression. So there's three distinct categories. All right, major depression is usually going to involve a combination of very, very impactful symptoms. It's going to cripple the basic routinized or the routines that you have throughout the day. And this could be something that happens in multiple episodes, not just one time. It's going to happen multiple times, potentially per hour, per day, per week, per month, those types of things. And it's going to interfere with your sleep, your either athletic performance or potentially your work, and then also your personal life. You're maybe not going to get the enjoyment out of your personal activities that you normally do. Now I'm going to skip down here to minor depression because we tend to talk about major and minor depression. We'll come back to systemic depression here in a second. Minor depression, the sufferer tends to have symptoms for a few weeks, maybe a little bit longer. This may not meet the full criteria, all the criteria for major depression. However, if it's not treated, then there's an increased risk that this minor depression can actually escalate into major depression. Okay? And that middle ground, that systemic depression, that's kind of a very, very unique category. And it sort of is the bridge between minor and major. So in systemic depression, the sufferer is going to have symptoms for many years. But each symptom might be relatively small and minor, But over time, and think of it as a snowball, right? It's gonna have a cumulative effect. That snowball is gonna get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger over time, and it's gonna become more severe. And then at that point, the sufferer may experience major depression episodes. And this is going to be difficult to diagnose because it's not something that's immediate. So, unless you have a mental health caregiver that has worked with you regularly for potentially years, it might be difficult to track and really, really understand this. Obviously, since this is a sport-based class, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about depression and its engagement with sport. And we know that so many sports, especially here in kind of American language and nomenclature, is associated with being mentally tough, right? And depression and other forms of mental illness or disorders were oftentimes associated with a sense of weakness, right? And this is something that's happened, I say, for centuries, but probably for thousands of years if you really think about it. And that stigma is still very impactful here in the modern society, but it started to change, right? And that change, if you look on here, you can actually click on this and you'll see individuals from the ESPN's The Jump discussing forms of depression, anxiety, and just mental health and the kind of the stigma. And then down here is actually a little bit locally. You can click on this again and you'll be able to see a story about a former local university's men's basketball coach discussing aspects of mental health. And just the realization that mental health is not just something that athletes need to focus on, but also coaches. And it's interesting because that lack of autonomy, maybe you don't necessarily have control over everything, but you have these heightened expectations and all this pressure. All this can lead to depression within not just the athletic setting, but also impacting that individual away from sports, whether it's a coach, whether it's an athlete. We need to be aware of all these things regardless. So if we're talking about historically that those that suffered from mental illness or disorders, things like that, were seen as ineffective members of society, then it's about overcoming that stigma, right? Because we know that sports are going to be associated with strength and character and constitution, and then positive mental health is associated with that as well. So if you're dealing with mental health and you're in sports, then how do you deal with all that? And this is really kind of interesting, is that some high profile athletes have come out to start talking about it, whether it's Michael Phelps. If you're thinking about even recent examples in the most recent Olympics, Kevin Love, here's a required reading in regards to, it's an article that he penned. So again, feel free to make sure that this presentation's in presentation mode. Click on it and it'll take you right to that article and you can read it and kind of see things from his point of view. It's written in a first person point of view. And 2014 was also a watershed moment here in American sports, because that was the year that the NCAA mandated that mental health programs be examined and established and then made available to student athletes. So we're really starting to see kind of the culmination of all this. We've had all of this information on arousal, stress, anxiety, depression, and it's been sequestered in the world of sports psychology for quite some time. But now, as high-profile athletes and coaches and fans and owners and mental health providers and intercollegiate athletic employees, as all these individuals start to recognize the importance of it, we're starting to have a discussion about how all these different things impact not just the performance aspect of sports, but also really at the core, the people that are part of sports.